All right, it should be going. Let's see. Okay. All right. Well, hi, everybody. Happy Friday. Just a heads up that the meeting today is being recorded, and we're really excited to have you here. So my name is Lana Leip, and I am a licensed clinical social worker, a private practice owner, doctoral student, and co-founder of Therapy Homeroom. And I will be your moderator for today. Alongside each of you. Before we get started, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just quickly go over a few administrative things. First and foremost, please make sure that if you haven't already, please make sure that your microphones are muted so that way we can reduce distractions and background noise. Today's meeting, again, I know I already mentioned, but today's meeting will be recorded. Both the recording and a short survey will be sent to you via email early next week. So if you have anything that you'd like to share, please make sure you, if you've got the time, please take the time to do that. We'd greatly appreciate your feedback. Also, we have a lot of information to cover today, so please raise your hand in the bottom. You'll see a little hand at the very bottom tab, and Anna will address your questions, when she's able to get a pause. If you have other questions ongoing, you can always put them in the chat as well. And then lastly, if you could put your fields, such as social work or LMFT, and what you're hoping to learn today in the chat, we would greatly appreciate that so we can know who's here and what you all are hoping to learn. And with all of that in mind, let's get started. Next slide, Anna, if you don't mind. Thank you. So this is the disclaimer, stating that, Anna is giving some really, really great information, but make sure that you're consulting, with your legal aid, with the state, with your professional licensing board, so on and so forth, to just make sure that everything is in accordance with where you work. And next slide, please. All right, go ahead.
Hi, welcome again. My name is Anna Widges. I'm here to kind of give some insight and information that I've gained in the experience I've had. I'm actually licensed in 5 different states. I got my undergrad at Purdue North Central in psychology with a minor in communications, knowing that I was going to continue to graduate school because my goal was to be a therapist. I earned that degree at Valparaiso University. During some of that schooling, I started in the field immediately as a mental health tech. So I've worked in this field since undergrad for quite some time, and my home state was Indiana. So I got licensed in Indiana as an LMHC, and I've continued to be licensed also in Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, and Arizona. As a clinician, I specialized in trauma, so that is where my heart is. I love to work with service members as well as civilians, working on some of those trauma-related presenting problems. However, I have in the past year worked at Kentucky Counseling Center as a care team lead. This position really has opened up my ability to see the admin as well as the clinical side, which has given me a lot of confidence to be able to talk to other clinicians about the billing and documentation needs in terms of passing an audit. So as a care team lead, I act as a billing supervisor when we have new staff on board. I am going to sign off on their notes as they are still going through the credentialing process. That may be for a fully licensed person, but they have some sort of insurance that isn't fully on board with them that our agency has. So I may be signing off on a fully licensed clinician's note, as well as those associate licenses until they can obtain and be fully credentialed. In addition to that, I still have boots on the ground with clients. I don't have an active caseload, but I am an intake coordinator. So I'm still very much doing the diagnosing, making sure that I'm seeing the different services that we offer, what could fit, and then having some experience in our EHR system as a clinician, as well as that admin role. I'm also in charge of onboarding. So I am able to provide the policies and procedures of my agency and what we've done to align ourselves to be in compliance with our payers. And finally, I'm also a care team lead. So I have about 20 to 30 staff under me at all times. So I'm always available and answering emails daily about questions, whether it is clinically based, safety protocol, or even just concerns and how should I document this or where should I go clinically. While I do not act as a clinical supervisor, I do have that status as an LPCCS in the state of Missouri, which is where I do most of my work at this time. Today, I'm hoping to go over different types of documentation, mainly diagnosing and an intake. As much as we learned in our schooling that we should not diagnose anybody the first time we meet them, insurance companies say otherwise. So how do we navigate that and make sure that we're still meeting the medical necessity? What does that look like in treatment planning? Trying to bill for treatment planning with some consultation notes, giving some examples of a progress note, and just making sure that we're still keeping information minimal, confidential, but protecting that it is going to be supportive if that documentation is ever required in a subpoena or to support a client, and I'll give some examples about that. There are a couple other types of notes, as well as I wanted to make sure that we just touch base on level of care. I know my experience in the past 2 or 3 years has been primarily telehealth. I've done private practice, I've worked in juvenile detention centers, I've also worked in home base. So being aware of the level of care in which you're providing and protecting yourself with some evidence-based screeners. As I go throughout this, like Lana said, you can kind of raise your hand and use some of the functions built into the presentation, but there are going to be spaces at the end because I want to have dialogues and be able to give any other insight that maybe you have more questions on or that I didn't explain or give insight to. So let's just jump right in. Intakes. 90791 is considered an event code. There's a difference between an event code and a service code. Events, while we still want to be accurate in exact times, it does not matter when you are contracted for that billing of the service in the event code. So an intake can be 28 minutes and it can be 68 minutes, but you're going to still get the same amount reimbursed because it's considered an event code. The way that my company works is we do accept Medicaid clients. So that's going to be usually the most strict when it comes to guidelines. And that's going to be what I default to. There are going to be some exceptions, especially if you're doing more work with commercial payers, where when you hear me say a 48-hour timeline, that is a requirement for Medicaid. If that note is signed 48 hours and 1 minute after that start of your service, it is no longer payable. But commercial insurances may allow that up to 30 days. So it's very important to know your contracts, but I will speak mostly in that restriction with Medicaid. Documenting exact minutes is recommended. This is required. And those minutes cannot overlap with any other services that you're billing for. So at my company, not only do we bill for the intake, but we also bill for a consultation code. And H0032, what we're going to see in a few slides, gives you that ability to also really just get reimbursed for the time spent with that documentation, that collaboration, but you have to be mindful that those cannot overlap even by 1 minute, or that's time fraud. In addition to that, you're going to always be looking for signatures, because if we don't have the consent, we don't really have the ability to continue working with that person because they're not consenting and they're not showing their involvement. Justifications are very important. Again, starting at that intake, we'll talk about different levels of diagnosing and how to maybe incorporate that, or when we need to update it as you gather more information. And then even documenting the willingness to change. And some of that is related to Medicaid. Again, Medicaid can be a little bit more particular when it comes to showing progression, which I do have a slide on, as well as their willingness to change. Is this something that was court ordered? Is this something that they have buy-in? Is this a child being forced by a parent? Kind of giving some of that insight even at the intake. And we try to provide checklists because we want people to succeed. This is a lot of information you're gathering. You have, maybe 60 minutes blocked off on your schedule. That's to get all of this information. Look for the justification for a diagnosis. Still create and develop a treatment plan. So this is kind of just a visual before we jump into the actual documentation. My company has an admin team that does a fantastic job obtaining registration packets, but make sure you're protecting yourselves. Liability. Do we have informed consent and other signatures? Do you have any no-show policies? Making sure that that's in the chart. And if it isn't, it's a good time to check it at the intake and make sure you can obtain those. With our EHR system, it has a beautiful setup that uses the SOAP note method and other mental status exams. So we encourage you not to leave anything blank. If it's not present, not reported, use a full sentence. Give me a little bit more than just leaving it blank so that we have properly documented that we've touched on all areas. And then again, I cannot stress enough justifying diagnoses because that's going to give the medical necessity to then allow that payer to continue to reimburse you for your services, as well as creating the treatment plan. And then ultimately, our therapists are then in charge of scheduling the ongoing services. This may be different for different agencies. Ours allows the admin to know the availability of a clinician. So intakes usually are just scheduled when there's an opening, but then you and that person should really develop a frequency, as that is a part of the treatment plan, and then have that set aside on your schedule. Reoccurring appointments really help to give a visual so that you're also not avoiding any overlapping or misscheduling. Again, you're going to hear it a lot. We emphasize that 48-hour rule. Otherwise, you are not going to get billed for your services. You're not going to get paid. So let's look at least what our EHR system is. This is for a fake client. Scooby, Mr. Scoobert do. I created these notes as a template to use when I am having new clients or new clinicians on board so that they have a visual. I personally am a visual person, and I like to treat others like I want to be treated. So one of the most important parts of a note is what we call the header. This top part is really what a lot of payers can have in an audit. If you are ever audited, ask them what they need. You do not have to provide the clinical documentation unless it is said. If you ever subpoenaed, ask what it means, redact things. You can keep your client's information protected while having a lot of it in the header to then support those exact minutes. Again, you can see here, even though our admin team would schedule an intake for 45 minutes, this has been changed to 47. So I know that it's not the cookie cutter thing that was on my schedule, but I took the time to use exact minutes. That service code is still matching. And a big thing for telehealth is really to be aware of what does your payer require for the location. If you are in office, that's probably not something that's ever been on your radar or of concern. But based on your insurance, Medicaid has 2. Telehealth, again, I'm in the state of Kentucky, 10, but UBH is actually Telehealth Kentucky 2. Literally yesterday, I got an email that Medicare changed. So this is something that is naturally going to be progressing. And now, in addition to Medicaid, Medicare is also switching to that Telehealth Kentucky 2. And if that location code is incorrect, you're going to get some bounce backs and you're going to have to make some edits and corrections to be able to have that service reimbursed. So the header is very important. And the last thing you see there are those participants. This can be telling based on the service code. Is it a family session? Is it a couples counseling session? Is this a minor who needs parent involvement? Whoever it is, we want to have that participation noted in the header as well as the body of the note, because I then, as the billing supervisor and care team lead, am going to make sure that you are also covering liability and we have ROIs on file if they're not for a minor guardian situation and other things in place. We have a whole couples counseling policy as well. But that header is really going to be one of the most important parts when it comes to billing. However, the body of the note is where we're doing the work. So this is going to have a breakdown of different sections of our intake where I work. The presenting problem is something that's going to be broad because it actually carries over to other documents. It doesn't have to have as specific information as you're going to see on the next slide because it will pull over to the treatment plan in our EHR system. The mental status exam is something that, again, is going to be something that should really be considered because we've had experiences where that functional status, it defaults to intact. If you use an all normal, it may say that it's intact. However, depending on a diagnosis and that specifier, if we have a major depressive disorder, severe, that DSM criteria denotes functional status is at least mild to severely impaired. So you want to make sure that that matches with the diagnosis, as well as you're supporting your client and where they're at. If they're going to call your records because they're going to pursue a disability and go through SSI, and we're saying that they're fully functional, that's conflicting information and may actually prevent them. And I've seen that happen in my current agency, where we really had to have some training and making sure, yes, they may be present, they're sitting in front of their screen and they're participating, but make sure you're looking at the totality of how that mental health is impacting their day to day. So mental status exams are important, capturing it from the intake, and then you can carry it over. Some EHR systems have SALT, same as last time, or all normal, but then you want to go through and really make sure that those are indicating what's happening. Risk assessments are another area that are built into our EHR and something that I highly recommend making sure you document. Ours has a built-in self-harm, suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, substance misuse, and I think there might be another one. So I just wanted to give some examples again to my staff onboarding, as well as in this presentation, of ways that you can say, hey, this was said historically, so I want to still note that, and I want it to be in the risk assessment so it's easy to pull out. It's not hidden in the trauma or psych history, as well as it is denied that it's present, right? If we do have any of those challenges, we want to make sure that we know, is it historical, is it present, and how do we know if a safety plan needs to be the next step or not. So risk assessments in an intake, as well as any other time you get into those areas. And then the biopsychosocial. I'm guessing this is something that's familiar with most people, kind of just getting really that background information so that you know the history. We know family history, medical history. So I won't go through all the details here, but again, just kind of giving a visual. Denied any hospitalization for mental health. I always ask that question because sometimes clients like to skip over some situations when you ask about past treatment. So I always have very specific things that I ask for and that I like to show as an example. Again, very thorough approach with lots of different categories. This is built into our EHR system. You can create your own. I know that was something we had to do in school, was making our own intake. The bottom of the intake is that really important part that we've already talked about, of the diagnosing. So I'm going to talk about that, as well as then show you the portion of the intake. So diagnosing is important as far as the medical necessity. F codes is what's going to be then sent to the insurance and the payer to show that they're not going to see what the justification is. However, they have the right to say, how do you know this is accurate? How do you know that your client is suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, not social anxiety disorder? So this is where it is important that you are being descriptive, that you are familiarizing yourself with that DSM-5. We're already in a text revision. And this is where those CEUs come and play with our licensure. It really is on us to make sure that we do know that things have changed, have been updated, and we can continue to support that. At my agency, we often recommend some diagnoses to have that level of psychological evaluations. In the recent years, social media has been great, but it really brings awareness to mental health. But I have some clinicians come and ask, hey, Anna, they said that they're diagnosed with this, but they're diagnosed from TikTok. So this is where you want to make sure you can report that they're telling you these symptoms, but you might want to make a referral to get a further diagnosis based on some of the information discussed with historical diagnosing. Ultimately, you are putting your name on that note, and you are supporting that you've asked those questions and that you've gotten enough information that they do meet the DSM criteria, while also recognizing there's plenty of diagnoses that have a lot of cushion. Adjustment disorder. It's a great code. It allows you 6 months with an individual to really tease out and find out if there's anything else going on with anxiety, depression, trauma, unspecified, specified. They allow you to cushion and give you the lowest level of impact, but still require that at the time of an intake for billing. So let's look at what that looks like on our intake. Objective content is something that, again, is built in. always encourage you to document and have that conversation that you discussed confidentiality, that you discussed HIPAA. I always like to go over our no-show policy so that there's no confusion on, the value of my time and their time on my schedule. And then I'm very upfront about their diagnosis because it will show up on the treatment plan. I would never want to have an individual come back on session 1 after the intake and say, I don't agree with a treatment plan. I didn't say that. So I say, it sounds to me like you have generalized anxiety disorder. My company also has the ability to do a lot of screeners, which insurance companies love evidence-based, right? So the GAD-7, go ahead and assign that. Have the supported data. It's going to help me know the severity, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, as well as a rule out. The important thing here is, at least in our EHR program, is to remove the F code. If you continue to have that F code on the document, that pulls for the insurance and billing. And even though you've added that RO, rule out, or whatever verbiage you choose, if the F code is still present, it's going to show up in their chart and their billing records. So I like to throw that onto Mr. Scubert's account here to kind of show, hey, I still want to look into this. I'm still aware as a clinician and the information we talked about, but for billing, you want to be aware of what your system pulls over and maybe not have the F code present so that it's not pulling over a diagnosis that you haven't confirmed. So I'm going to take a pause and ask if there's any questions over intake information. I feel like I go a little bit fast, so I want to make sure I pause with each section because we will then shift into the treatment plan next, which is important to then continue to bill for services after the intake. So use the hand button at the bottom if anybody has a question at this time. All right, so go ahead and unmute yourself. What is your question?
I have 2 questions, and I understand if one of them is not answerable right now, that's okay. But that came up. One is when you say you like bill for intake, like I do, I send people all my intake paperwork, and then I, first session spend maybe 20 minutes going over the most important piece and like just dive right in. Does it look weird if you never use an intake code? Because I just build normally for the first session.
Intake codes, in my experience, reimburse you at the highest rate. So you may be losing out on money. However, I'll also caveat this. My company asks that we do intakes every 2 years. So if this has been an ongoing client, we actually look at the biller's contracts. And for some, they can be billed every 2 years within the same agency. So we're going to go ahead and say, let's get that updated information and get paid the highest amount. So sometimes it is an intake on the service code, but they've seen this therapist for years, and it's really just confirming. This is where you may lean on the EHR system that has a history button and per chart from 2022, confirm 2024. So we're still confirming as the intake, but you can actually bill it depending on the insurance up to 2 years later. Some insurances are less, and we do that because it is the highest paying out code. So you may be just shorting yourself on money, and I would maybe look into that.
Interesting. Well, I mean, for me, and I know this is different for everyone taking different insurance, the local insurance that I take, HMSA, I only use their telehealth option, and it just reimburses the same every appointment, no matter what. Like, I don't bill even. It's just like, this is your reimbursement for LCSW. Here you go. So that's why I didn't even like there was codes or anything. So okay. And then the second question is, if is adjustment disorder only seen as like a 6 months diagnosis code? If it's just adjustment disorder unspecified, if it also has plus depression or depressed mood and anxiety, is that okay for over 6 months? Because I truly have a couple people that their lives are just stressful because of capitalism, and there's no other fucking code.
Which is totally understandable. However, if you look at that DSM criteria, it specifically says 6 months. So a biller is going to say, this is 7 months of it. I'm not going to reimburse. So again, it would maybe depend if it's more of private practice, self-pay, that you could still do it. But if I was your billing supervisor I'm going to go back to every treatment plan and I'm going to count when did you first have it versus where do we still have it. Now, the caveat to that is there enough information to know they're adjusting from a different situation? They had adjustment disorder in 2023. They come back 8 months later in 2024 because we had a different situation. First, we were dealing with a going to college, and now we're dealing with family dilemma. If I can still see that those are two different adjustments, even though 8 months has passed and they did 3 to 6 months billing of an adjustment, I would still say that we could justify it. However, if it is somebody that's not really changing and it's ongoing, I would look for those unspecified. Does not meet full criteria for MDD, but has symptoms of depression. Those don't have any limitations. Those time codes do not, or they don't have a time attached to that code, but it's not still giving a full MDD or GAD.
Okay. Yeah, that sucks. Okay, thanks for clarifying. No, because truly, like, I see a couple people, it's just like they're great, except their jobs suck, or they're great, except they're can't afford their bills. So it's like, what the they don't. I don't know.
It's out of their control, but they're still adjusting and they're trying to make it. Which again, giving them credit to seek and support themselves. So having to navigate the insurance portion is advocate. My clients are always going to have my voice behind them, and whether it's maybe then changing that verbiage for what they're adjusting. But I would caution that you may get pushback if you have that adjustment disorder over 6 months, because they're going to look at letter of the law versus spirit of the law. DSM says 6 months. Another question?
Yeah, and Leilani, what you just said about, folks being in diagnosis or in adjustment, like especially with the pandemic, there were so many things and are continue to be so many things that it has impacted. And so that was really tricky for me and has been. So I have a question. So as I've been looking through, what you've written in the different sections, I don't see any quotes of like client said, they're really struggling, having a hard time, or some days are harder than others. Do you have any feedback about how often to use quotes versus kind of the way that you have things paraphrased in here thematically?
Excellent question. This is a test client. In my real documentation, I have quotes in almost every area because I want that voice to be heard. I also say, this is what I heard, and I'll read it back sometimes because I don't want to misquote. But quotations are recommended. Another cool feature that we have in our EHR program is some people will fill out a client history form ahead of time, and I can pull that onto their intake paperwork with one button, and I put quotes on it because they wrote it. So even if it was written or if it was verbally told to me, those were the words from my client, and I'm going to put the quotes in there and use them as much as possible. I'll even use it in the diagnosis justification. Has had it all my life. More than 6 months, we meet the criteria for GAD. A great question.
And so in terms of, because I try to limit what I'm, sharing, is there a rule of thumb or just a general way to make sure that there's the balance of satisfying the payer and then also like not, doing a Dear Diary of the client's their words?
Yeah, I think the intake's hard because we're here to ask all of those questions. So it may help when and I did include a progress note because we still want to have some captured of, I'm a professional and you're paying me to do this work, while also then representing this individual, because everything is different from person to person. We're all our own snowflakes, right? So it's tough because the intake is supposed to be specific. However, I'd never use any other person's name. You won't see a spouse's name or a friend's name. It'll just say friend. So I'm protecting other people's information from being used in court or trying to claims of diagnosing another person. I've seen that in some of my liability insurance examples of. So intakes, you are trying to give as much specific information, but sometimes I'll just leave it broad. And I'll have that conversation like, well, sounds like you had a poor relationship with mom due to a family fight. Maybe they told me the details of the fight, but I'm not putting in all the tea. Does that help kind of give some balance?
That does. Thank you for that. And I have one last question. Could we go back a couple of slides to where you had the functional status? That one.
The
So
mental status exam.
yes, I'm sorry. So so the functional status where it says mildly impaired, are we, if we denote that there is an impairment, are
Mhm.
we supposed to write that elsewhere to say there is an impairment socially or an impairment, at work? Are we supposed to be also denoting that somewhere else to support what we're marking here?
I think it would show up in possibly a couple areas. There is a symptom section in the SOAP that we will look at in a progress note. So you should be definitely recording and seeing any progress, whether it's regression or no progress of those symptoms, which would be symptomatic if we are interfering with the domain of life, home life, work and school life, ability to have relationships. So those are probably going to be captured in some of the progress notes, as well as that's going to be supportive and a justification for a diagnosis. If we are so sad that we're isolating and canceling our appointments, that's still affecting that functional status, which can support the justification and the diagnosis, and then probably will be monitored as far as some of those treatment plan goals. So yes. I don't know if that answered your question, but I would say it probably is going to be found in a couple ways.
Gotcha. Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'll even call somebody out on their notes when I'm reviewing. And I did that earlier this week where I said, hey, your symptom section says couldn't get out of bed, but you have their functional status as an intact. Please confirm. I always reject a note saying, please confirm, because I was not there and I cannot tell you what happened, but I can then also support if we have an audit, they are able to get any revisions to a note and they're going to see that you confirm that information, which actually comes in play a lot with the duration. If anybody submits a note for 30, 45, or 60 minutes, I'll reject it and get confirmation because you were there and and I'll try to support you if I see something conflicting in that note. But great question, because this was really something that since my position was created about 1 year ago, we really took a lot of time of retraining the importance of a mental status exam, because after the intake, the EHR just kind of pulls it over and people tend to keep the same things from session to session, but we want to make sure that we do have attention to detail if it is changing. And there's just so much, right? An intake has so many different sections. And it's great if you're able to get some of that ahead of time. Again, whether it's a client history form or a registration packet. And this is where you may, there are some quotes. Yeah, I'm glad I had some quotes. Everyone in the house there in the family history section. A few good friends. So I do recommend quotes. Anything else with the intake? We are going to shift gears a little bit to the treatment planning, but I really am thankful for some of the interaction that you guys have had so far. This graphic is something I took off the internet and it's in our orientation slides because we talk a lot about treatment plans, but we have to make sure that they're smart and really breaking down what that means, because that's what insurance requires. They want them to be specific, measurable, which is something that, again, we did a lot of training on in the past year, attainable, relevant, and time-based. Time-based was another piece that I had to do a lot of work with as far as some of my staff's writing styles. And then lo and behold, December, our EHR system updated and included it because it's such an important piece as far as having some awareness to what is required from the insurance. They want to know, when is this going to happen? How long do we anticipate these services? So SMART is that nice acronym, but let's look and see what our treatment planning looks like, where my current agency is. That presenting problem, again, is going to pull over from our intake. Same exact information. You can see it's pretty short and concise. And then for every treatment plan, you're going to have at least one goal and one objective. You can have multiple goals. You can have, each goal is always going to have one objective. You can have one goal with 3 objectives, but bare minimum, what is the goal? And the objective is the details of how are we going to get there. That's where you have to make sure you have that SMART level. So in this situation, I do use a quote because I want to know what their goal is for therapy. I want to enjoy life and not be worried all the time. So then my interpretation is client wants to learn ways to feel more in control of her thoughts and learn coping skills. Well, then how do we get there? What do we do? The objective would be to identify 3 triggers. I'm not saying triggers because that's not measurable. If we did 1, I didn't meet my goal. If I did 4, we're an overachiever. but at least 3 triggers related to their anxiety. And how am I going to do this? When am I going to do this? We're going to report on those triggers each session. You'll see at the bottom, I have a prescribed frequency of weekly. So I already have some other time-based built in. And this is where I went ahead and updated that we also have the ability to kind of click and drop down. What are those skills and interventions as a therapist I'm going to provide? What's the modality? This is important if you're having different services in one agency, whether it be individual, family, couples, targeted case management, medication management. So the modality is going to be specific to those services you're billing for. Again, an estimated frequency and that completion. So our agency will do a treatment plan with a client every 3 months. You'll see this kind of correlates with some of the abilities to bill for it in our consultation codes. But every 3 months, we're going to update our treatment plans. And our EHR system has it built in that at day 89, so every 90 days, there's a reminder on your to-do. Additional information that you may have included in the treatment plan might be that discharge criteria. How do you and the client know when goals are met and what does that look like? I'm going to be honest, this is a very broad one that I do for most people because I believe people can be in as counseling as long or as little as they want. This is a skill and a support that people have often once the presenting problem has resided and they want to continue to have that rapport that they've built with you as a clinician. So whenever they feel that they have all of the abilities to maintain those, they can feel that they can discharge. I personally put a very generic safety plan because we require signatures on our treatment plans. So if anybody were to contact me in a crisis, I can say you can go to your portal and view the additional information for a safety plan. And then if a crisis or a risk assessment is determined, I make a very specific one to that person. That individual would then work on it in collaboration with me. Our EHR system allows us to upload it and require an e-signature so that I still have another form of the safety plan specific to that person while having a generic one built into their treatment plan for a reference if needed. And again, at the bottom, that prescribed frequency is important. If I have somebody who's seeing somebody twice a week and they have weekly, I would challenge that as a payer. Why are you seeing them twice as much? So if something's changed, they've got court coming up, there's more stressors, then we're just going to update the treatment plan. As long as we're supporting that this is what we say, and when we put our signature on there, we're declaring that these services are medical necessary. And again, the appropriate diagnosis is given because those are the things the payers are going to look at. So I'm going to show the documentation that we have in our consultation code, but I want to pause again and allow you guys to have any questions about SMART goals or what the treatment plan needs to have in relation to billing and insurance. Again, hopefully this is something you guys do often every time you meet a new person or have the ability to change or update things, but you can bill for it. If you don't have a signature, though, you are putting yourself at risk of not having that consent. And so you want to make sure that you have the signature. You can't have a session. So as an intake coordinator, I will provide the intake, and then I will help coordinate who and when the client will come back to and work and see, but I do not create a treatment plan. So once they have their ongoing provider, they have to create a treatment plan to establish his services. So our EHR won't even allow them to open a progress note because we don't have any active goals established. There is a big push in making sure that objectives are measurable. I will reject it if you just say wants to reduce anxiety. What does that mean? Does that mean that we're reducing it by learning 5 coping skills? That we have anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most anxious, a baseline of 7 with a goal of 4. But I'm going to give some suggestions and do some coaching if I don't see those goals are measurable, because I know that the insurance companies are going to look for that, as well as when you may need to update it outside of our 3 months. If you have a change in a diagnosis, you didn't know. I've had this once where somebody was coming in related to a grief situation, and they were coming in at 11 months. Prolonged grief disorder requires it to have happened 12 months ago. So I had to give an unspecified depressive disorder, ruling out prolonged grief, knowing that once that 12-month mark hit, I was then within the DSM criteria and I could update. So you will have some diagnoses changes like that, or just things happen and they develop. change in frequency like I hinted before, or in a positive way. Maybe they're switching from weekly to every other week, like they're doing well, but you still want to support that. And again, at any time, if a chart is inherited or you are taking a gap, we just got through the holidays, a lot of cancellations happen. You want to make sure that you're still within the dated time frame, whether you said those goals were going to be achieved in 3 months, 6 months, but that they're active. Otherwise, you are not going to have any reimbursement because they're going to challenge you didn't have active goals. And speaking of reimbursement, this is the consultation note. H0032 is an event code. So it's very similar to the event style we talked about in an intake. It doesn't matter how long, you're not going to get paid if you spend 20 minutes more than somebody who spends 5 to 7 minutes. I have rejected and challenged somebody who billed for 1 minute. Let's be realistic. You had to spend a little bit more than 1 minute, at least confirming an existing treatment plan was going to continue. But the diagnosis, as long as you haven't completed at the time of the intake, it pulls over to your treatment plan, which pulls over to all other documents. I'm going to make sure 3 documents were submitted on the same day. All diagnoses match for the same date of service. There are sometimes people have that treatment plan and update and they do make a change or they add a different severity specifier. They go from mild to moderate. If I don't see all 3 match, that's a different F code. I'm going to reject it because as a biller, that's not going to look congruent. And then again, always capturing and documenting attempts for a signature, because without that signature, the future services are not going to be billable. So this is kind of what we do in an intake as far as the intake biopsychosocial, and then treatment planning to then establish the ongoing services and billing for it in a consultation code. Does anybody have questions as far as that documentation of a consultation code or things related to the treatment plan before we go into progress notes? Yes.
So how often are we able to use the H0032 code?
Fantastic question. We, in our experience, because we've had audits, in fact, we just had an audit and we got a 95%, and I'm very proud of that. So hopefully the information I'm giving you today is very applicable because this was something we got kicked back in an audit, and we found that you have to do it about every 30 days. So I've had some people, actually I had one gentleman who specialized in cognitive processing therapy, and he would always do a treatment plan, giving homework to the client to learn about this therapy. And then session 2, they would decide if they wanted to do the structured approach or more of a talk therapy. And then he would create the treatment plan based on the client's decision. And so him and I just had that understanding of, you're going to have an updated treatment plan, but because it's within 30 days, you don't have to do the consultation code. However, if there is enough medical necessity, something really has changed and you feel that you could support that, we have allowed them within 30 days. But the rule of thumb to my staff is every 30 days, a consultation code can be billed. Gotta love this field where there's always a little bit of gray. You can always maybe get away from it, but we did get some pushback. Like, that is something that you don't want to overbill this for, because then they'll question you and maybe ask for some money back. This is also something that we actually have verbiage in our self-pay clients that they are aware that we do treatment planning and consultation notes. And even as a self-pay client, they are aware that there is a charge for $10 for this service to happen. So there's lots of different ways to protect yourself in your paperwork and to really support the time and amount of work you do inside and outside of a session, ensuring that that chart is captured and that you're able to continue to bill with an accurate treatment plan. So even if you don't accept Medicaid, you can still look into this as something in your practice, as possibly still having the service, a chart or a documentation in the chart of it, and possibly billing that person directly.
And with the H0032 code, are you able to use it if someone sends you an email that's like related to you, where you're able to tie it into treatment planning or diagnoses? Are you able to use it for something like that?
I would say probably not. I would say it's still important to document whether it's a contact note or a miscellaneous note, but for the billing, it would be captured in one consultation note. even if it maybe happened in a couple different time frames. So it's a total of 15 minutes. Email me later to confirm, but it wouldn't be two separate. Great questions. All right, so jumping into progress notes. So this is pretty much the bread and butter of where you're going to see those documentations from session to session. And again, we're going to start at the header of the note. This is where most of it will be pulled out in an audit. And we're going to start with those duration minutes. 90837, 90834, and 90382 are probably the most popular CPT codes that we use. They are I'm going to start at the bottom. 90832 has to be a minimum 16 minutes with that client, all the way up to 37 minutes with the client. Once you've hit that 38-minute mark, up to 52 minutes, you're able to do a 90834 for a 45-minute session. And then 53 minutes up to 67 minutes is the 90837. So it's specific to know not only what the service code is, but then meeting those stricter guidelines of Medicaid billing by having specific minutes noted. Again, being aware of what your service contract is for location. If you are doing telehealth, if you're in office, I still am going to recommend, and you're going to see in this example, of documenting the location both in the header as well as the body of the note. I know I have several people who work hybrid, and a lot of times EHR systems are going to have a default location, and it's going to default to one even though you are documenting it something different. But if I don't have you document it differently in the body of the note, I don't always know unless I'm going through a chart and realizing you guys aren't in the same city. So making sure that you have some checks and balance within your own documentation is something that I ask my staff to do. So location is in the body as well as the header. And again, knowing that those location they change, LCSWs just had to get updated with Medicare changing as of 2024. That diagnosis is going to be the same. It's going to continue to pull over. If you had it on the intake note, it's the same that's on your treatment plan. I will sometimes make sure that it's not been changed. I've had people change it on a progress note, but then you're going to have to support that in an updated treatment plan. So again, that no code indicates that I removed the F code, and we're not going to have any billing show that rule out of a PTSD for this client. And then the mental status exam. I did go through and I changed it. I think in the intake, the judgment and impulse was fair, and now it's good. I will say for some reason, our all normal defaults to excellent. And it is really hard as a fully mental health professional to say that I have excellent judgment and insight all the time. So I often will reject if somebody has 2 excellents listed or even 1 to confirm that mental status exam, so that we're not just falling into a trap of hitting all normal or not really taking the time to assess anything that has changed. But that for some reason is something that our EHR system does is excellent. And again, that functional status, having any congruency with the specifier, especially with MDD, if it has a severity of severe, it's going to have to be mild to moderate at minimum, as well as what does the body of your note say. We talked a lot about treatment plan goals, and this is something that's Medicaid specific, but they want to see the tracking of those goals. So we have a drop down that's very handy. I've had some people try to put their own things. This is not anything that we require, but this is something coming right from the insurance company. So you're going to want to use something like this to note the progress. However, be mindful, if you continue to have a maintained goal, they're going to say, cool, why are they coming to services? So this is where I've had somebody reach out in an email and say, Anna, like, therapy is what's helping them maintain it. I said, okay, I agree. Let's see, how can we rephrase the goal? So maybe being aware of the verbiage, we'll continue therapy weekly to have maintained control over symptoms, and they can always be progressing on that. So some of it's a little bit of semantics, but you do want to be aware of how you're tracking the progress, because some payers, again, thinking the most strict, Medicaid is going to want to see just these words: improve, progressing, no progress, regressed. We do have not addressed used often because we do case management services. Sometimes we have medication management, all within one agency, as well as individual and couples. So it's okay if it's not addressed or on hold, but the maintained is the only one that we caution on onboarding. And I will look at it as a billing supervisor. Hey, you've had 2 sessions in a row that this has been maintained. Do we need to have a treatment plan update? So I wanted to show that because it's kind of small how it's built into our system, but there is that objectives portion, and you can see where we have progress progressing. And so we're noting what's going on and having that connection of the services to the treatment plan. In addition to that, you can see the risk assessment is always going to be an option in our EHR. It has a box to check saying that they denied risk, but if you don't check it, you have the ability to do lots of different spaces like we saw in the intake. And this is where it's kind of broken up, but it has a SOAP note built in. SOAP is subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. And so this is where you might see some of that functional status again, where we're having challenges going to a social event because our anxiety is talking us out of it. We aren't able to get to work. We called off for work because we were feeling too sad. So you may have some support in that subjective report. This is where I always like to ask, where are our levels of anxiety? I'm a fan of a Likert scale. You can see that in my documentation here. As well as then moving into the objective, you can see my very first line it was telehealth. So I know that this was a telehealth session, and I specifically use our platform and recommend that because we had a period of time where our EHR system was having a lot of updates and it was very glitchy. And we had a lot of therapists going back to like DoxyMe. Great. We want to use HIPAA compliant and secure networks. But if I were to pull up your activity log, I have no record. So you just need to let me know where it was so that I know that the client connected with you in a secure network, because you can't use your cell phone. You can't use FaceTime. There's a lot of ways that, again, I'm protecting you with liability, because in August of 23, at least in the state of Kentucky, they really locked down no more phone sessions. That's a very outlier to get reimbursed for, as well as having to have that HIPAA and confidentially secured telehealth platform. Objectively, this is also where you want to give yourself that credit. What did you do as the professional to support your client? So I am a big one on handouts. I like tangible things as a human, so let me give you something to look back at. I don't expect you to memorize anything because we talked for 20 minutes about a thought challenge. So I want to give you credit and put it in there that I gave them that handout, as well as, again, we have those check boxes that are the same things that we use on our treatment plan for the interventions. The A, or additional notes section and assessments, I'm always a big fan as far as screeners, getting that evidence base of where we're at with baselines. I'd ruled out a possible PTSD diagnosis, so let's go ahead and give them a PCL5 to see if there's anything indicating. So really just trying to support that medical necessity, as well as limiting. You're not giving everything, all of the details. You're still protecting your client's confidentiality as far as what happened. So in there, got into arguments with her husband, yells when she's frustrated, but I didn't say that they were fighting over the fact that he cheated on her and brought an STD. Like, I see that sometimes, and I'll say, hey, like, remember, if this was ever to be brought up in court, do we know that? Is there a medical record? I can't confirm that. So then you also want to say, as client reported. So being aware of some of those details, again, as that question earlier, it is a little bit of a balancing act, because I have been subpoenaed and I did have to answer questions and say, I don't know. Based on the notes, I do not know. I cannot recall. And that's okay. We see a lot of people and we help as many people as we can. So being able to support while protect. Again, the plan section is important, and a lot of things that I will still review and refresh with my staff. I want to know what and when. What are they working on? And when are you going to follow up on that? It may be broad by client will return next week to report on their ability to practice coping skill. But a lot of times I have people say, we'll journal. Well, when are they coming back? How often are they journaling? You can be a little bit more specific here. That's going to help with that accountability and consistency from session to session. I often would review a plan section before I would see another person if they came in like every other week, because I like to hold the client accountable because you came here for change. So let's make sure that that change is being supported. So I'll take another pause after going through the progress note. Again, scrolling up to the top of that. If anybody has any questions, because this is kind of the day-to-day documentation. So if you have questions, I really encourage that dialogue and appreciate the participation so far.
So under the plan, there will be times where the client and I will co-create like homework, quote unquote. Okay, so journaling or that kind of thing, but they'll come in maybe the next session and either they did not get to it because, their, situation changed, or they were depressed and like just couldn't, or, they had an emergency and we end up talking about something else. How would you denote that in the following note then?
Yeah, I will most likely put it in the objective. Like, objectively, client reported they did not do homework. Subjectively, I may support due to, depression, lack of motivation, was unable to. So it might kind of go into both areas. But usually for me, I'm going to look that in the objective. Did they complete it or did they not complete it? And then the subjective is going to be a little bit more of the why. That's what they're reporting or what I'm observing. But I definitely have that continuity from session to session. And then after like 3 weeks in a row, I can go back and say, wow, maybe we need to take a pause on this. Maybe we need to switch to a different homework or like a self-care, so that we're also not just having this like defeatist or negative, I have to tell my therapist I didn't do it again. Because if I notice that, okay, this has been 3 weeks and I'm keeping that in the objective to easily find did not complete homework, I'm going to make sure I'm adjusting and meeting the client where they're at as well.
Is there anything that could come back? Because I know that we as clinicians know this, but when it comes to the payer, where the payer may say, oh, well, this client is unmotivated, is not progressing, and then they may deny the service for that client.
This is where ask questions. If you are audited, you ask, what do they need? And most of the time they just need the header information. You also have the ability to redact information. So if they do say, I want the entire chart, you can still go through and redact it and still give different levels before giving everything, because you still want to document where the client is. And I would argue and support that means they need counseling, and have that kind of mentality. But I hear that hesitation of, I don't want to put anything in there that could be used against them, which is important, because if you work, again, I worked in a juvenile delinquent center in Indiana with the highest risk male population. We had a lot of gentlemen who were still exploring the idea of, can I go into the military? Military does not like mental health diagnoses. So you had to kind of navigate what was going to be devastating them to have in a chart to accurately describe what was going on if they were having some optimal deficient or ODD, while still also supporting the client in some of their future goals. So documentation can be very important as far as omitting, because it's going to be best for the client. I had that with another adult who had a negative experience in the military, was diagnosed with something and discharged when she did not feel it was right to her. So it was very important that that was not on her chart with me at all. And I respected that. And it was something that I felt was clinically appropriate. I feel like I might have deviated a little bit from the original question, but did that kind of help answer where documentation can kind of fluctuate based on the client's need?
It does. And what you said, it applies, because again, I don't want to, because we again see it as this is something that, okay, this is why they need therapy, or, we're maybe working on something else. But again, I don't ever want the client to be harmed, or be denied services because of the payer. Yeah, no, thank you for that.
This is where it can also be important, the type of document you have in a chart. A psychotherapy note versus, and I cannot recall the other name, but there are different types of notes that are then for you in the client's chart, but not a part of the client's clinical record, so that you are still able to have it, but it's never going to be pulled into their clinical records, so that you, again, have that. You're not required to memorize all those details, but you still have a place in a record for it that's not going to be subpoenaed. So there are different levels of documentation as far as still being able to record what you know to be accurate while protecting what's in the medical chart. But a lot of balancing acts, and our goal is always to advocate for the client. So always, I would say, err on what's going to be best for them. That's why we try to diagnose at the bottom level before shifting to anything else. Again, going back to why can't we have adjustment disorders longer than 6 months? With that being said, this one is a very wordy slide, so I'm not going to read it word for word, but I want to show the importance when it comes to add-on codes as it pertains to the biller. So all of this being said, those bullet points are different examples of how someone might add a 90785, which is an interactive complexity code. But the big thing is down here. Oh, if I click it, it's gonna change it. Down here is where you want to make all of that to be said. What I require is copy and paste this due to this. You go and you see what they need to see, how that's supported and justified. So in the additional notes section, 90875 was added to this session due to the need to manage maladaptive communication. It's literally word for word how I have it in my records so that I know if we get audited, we have the verbiage that they require to support an add-on code. So I just wanted to kind of give some visuals as far as what some of those could look like and the level of details that those payers are looking for. I'm not sure that this even really changes billing much as far as like more payment for the service, but we had gotten some kickback in our audits, and this resulted in a very long email that I tried to pare down to at least bring into this presentation that we do get feedback that those codes matter and they have to be supported in the body of a note. Any questions on that? Again, very wordy, but just to show the level of detail that insurance companies look at sometimes. So if anybody is still reading, I'll give just a couple more seconds before I switch to the next slide. Giving a couple other add-on codes. Again, we understand crisis happens at times. I've had some staff members reach out and say, hey, they messaged me, they were in crisis. I actually did a phone call for 25 minutes and we were able to tease out based on that client and the exception of the phone call being understood with their treatment plan that we still billed it at 90832, but there are codes if you go beyond that 67-minute mark for a 90837 to then add on the crisis code, giving yourself more time to be billed, even though it was at a progress note for individual counseling that went over 67 minutes. So knowing what those are, again, making sure you're aware of any requirements that your payers have. The 99050, if you're a staff member who works with us part-time in the evenings and weekends, we don't require you to put that on there every time, but it is something if it's outside of your typical to kind of give yourself some awareness or really hold yourself accountable. Are you working beyond your hours? We don't want burnout. We want to provide boundaries for you as well as your clients. The big thing is, as far as the context of documentation and billing, make sure that it's supported and justified. Moving on, just touching base again about the totality of a chart and making sure if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So if it happened outside of a session, there's a couple different ways that you can document contact. We have contact notes that are specific with email, text message, phone call. What was that connection that you, and to who did you have it to? Was it with a guardian? Was it with a spouse that has an ROI on file? So making sure that you're giving yourself that specific information, how long and what content was discussed. Was it to remind them to sign a treatment plan? Sent an email as treatment plan wasn't signed yet. I like to see those in a chart because it shows that we're having a lot of effort to get that signature, even if that client has maybe had. What we will allow is session 1 is when you have that first created. So whether it's an intake or it's at the time it needs to be updated. Session 2, I'm going to make sure that at least electronically it's been shared that the client can sign it. But by session 3, if I don't have a signature, I'm rejecting all future notes until I have that signature. I'm not going to let you get 4 or 5 sessions down the road and this client not show back up and us not be able to get a signature. And I will recommend consider canceling all future appointments until signature is obtained. So this is where contact notes start showing up in a chart that they sent the email, and that we're really getting that information shared. Sometimes it may be, again, with a parent who sent an email before the session informing of an incident at school. However, if it's something outside of that and it's still related to the client, you might want to consider a miscellaneous note. Usually I see these when it comes to mandated reporter situations. So if we have to do any of those CPS type reports, I want to look for as much detail as possible. Who is the name of the operator, and did you get that case ID number? Again, it's not necessarily contacting somebody within the treatment plan, but it's pertinent to what happened in the chart and protecting you liability-wise that you were disclosed information that enacted your mandated reporting status. Sometimes it might be related to contact with a PCP or a case manager reached out. I've had that before where for some reason they like to always tell the case manager, can you let my therapist know this? And so I would just document there, like, was informed by case manager. But again, just protecting yourself. If it's not in a chart, it didn't happen. As well as terminating of services. If you don't have a system in place where you send a letter or you have some sort of process to sever that connection of the therapeutic relationship, you still have some liability for that client. So we have termination notes that can be submitted whenever it's determined. Have they not shown for over a month? Is that a policy where due to discontinued services or contact, the services were rendered? You know what? I wasn't in the best scope. They need somebody who has EMDR training and I'm in cognitive processing therapy. So transferred. You would still do the termination note because that and our system says that they're terminating with you as a provider. It also triggers me to remove you from that chart, which is protecting HIPAA, because if you are no longer providing therapy, you don't need access to their chart. So when I first started, I felt like that word was really harsh, termination or firing. Depending where you're from in the South, they call it firing a lot. But termination notes are going to protect you, because if you still have an open mental health relationship and they go out and they do something, you could be then questioned. If you knew, was that risk determined? Was Tarasoff in place? So termination notes can be a really good part of wrapping up a chart or protecting you when the discontinued contact has occurred. Any questions on the different note types? Again, just kind of giving yourself the ability to tease out what's important for a chart and protecting you, because liability is really where this place comes in. All right, we are getting towards the end, but I wanted to at least show an example of a termination note. Again, one of the main situations I see is that discontinued contact. They came in for their intake and then never came again. I've had some people where they never even saw the client. I want to make you know there is a Z code. That is no diagnosis. So if you have an EHR system that requires a diagnosis to complete some sort of information in the chart, there is a Z code. That is literally no diagnosis. Otherwise, if you had some contact, you did do the intake, it's going to carry over some of that information from the diagnosis section. Treatment modality and interventions. Sometimes people just copy and paste their treatment plan. I usually do just a quick couple sentences about what I usually do or what I worked on with them. And then I note why. Our policy is 2 no-shows. No call, no shows, and they can be terminated. We always allow our therapists to decide if they want to use that policy or if they have any leniency or flexibility. I also encourage you guys to protect your time. So no shows and using any fees that may be in place in your intake paperwork, as well as then setting those boundaries. A lot of times if I have somebody who has a lot going on, right? Like, we're human, they're human. She was in jail. She couldn't call me to cancel. All right, then I'm going to document in the plan section. Will attend next appointment as scheduled, or is aware they will be terminated. And so then I feel like I've really had that conversation and allowed them to maintain as much as they could with me therapeutically before having to transfer them to a new therapist. So it's important when I see these to really check what was going on with the outcome. Are they still going to be at my company, or is this person going to then, once it's submitted, switch to an inactive? Again, showing that difference from still being active in the company and liability versus we still keep a chart on file because we do that from our ethics code. So moving away from documentation a little bit, but still giving just some space to talk about appropriate level of care. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, the CSSRS. I've actually used it at multiple locations, so I know it's a very standardized form, but it's really good at teasing out, are you in the appropriate level of care? If you're in a telehealth practice, this is the lowest level. So I created this for my staff, and I wanted to provide it to you in this training to just give some support in how to also document that we know that we feel comfortable with them staying on our caseload, or that we're going to give those referrals. So we have kind of a red, yellow, green light. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide because it shows you what those questions are specifically in a very succinct form. There is that direct link to the CSSRS. There are lots of different versions that I've seen as far as companies adapting. But the big thing is we're looking at present suicidal ideation as well as still understanding some lifetime experiences. So you can also see that the system has a built-in of that yellow, orange, and red to give a really good indicator. So somebody maybe had an attempt when they were in middle school and now they're in their 40s. It's still going to give us some sort of medium risk because they had that impulsivity and they had not a plan, not just the plan, but they actually took action versus somebody who presently, okay, we're starting to think about it. That's DSM criteria, right? Thoughts related to death, normalizing that that's part of an MDD diagnosis, but where are the thoughts going? Are we starting to actually think about how we'll do it? Are we starting to make preparations? Are we in imminent danger? So this is where when we are in the moment, oftentimes it can be very scary. So I just wanted to just give some quick references of those reds. What do we need to do? Do we need to make those referrals out? Where do we really want to make sure we're covering our liability and having that safety plan created? And again, if you weren't familiar with it, giving you that knowledge that the CSSRS is a fantastic tool to help use to protect you and your clients that they're in the appropriate level of care. Any questions on the CSSRS? Again, I'll go up so you can kind of see that. But it is a fantastic, and you can change the questions to age appropriateness, right? If you're talking to a 6-year-old, it's going to be very different than if you're talking to an adult when you're asking, do you have any thoughts about death? And how would you make that happen type of thing. So being aware of the age and population you're serving. But ultimately, the big thing that I stress is always having your notes signed within 48 hours. Again, that being the most strict approach with a Medicaid contract. Remember, if you are a telehealth provider, that the client must be in the state that you're licensed in. That's where, again, the location may be congruent. We've started having people actually put the state of Kentucky versus just via telehealth, so that with the holidays, if somebody logs in and it's a different background, hey, where are we at? And confirming you can still have that service. Otherwise, you have to end it as you are not licensed, if you are not licensed in that state. And then the importance of treatment plans, those signatures, and making sure that you're in active goals so that if you were to be audited, there's no time lapse, there's no overlaps, and you're able to still have those services rendered and reimbursed. We're coming to the end, so I'm going to open it back up. This is the spot if you have any other questions, comments, concerns from today's presentation on documentation and billing.
One of the things that I struggle with the most when it comes to documentation is knowing how to be succinct with what it is I did. So I know when I'm going through, I can go in and out of CBT, ACT, like I'm pulling from different modalities. Any feedback on how to make sure that that information is succinct, so we're also obviously highlighting our clinical, role in that space?
Yeah. So when it comes to So my wheelhouse is cognitive behavioral therapy. So we did a thought challenge. Whether it was teaching it or doing it, you could be succinct and did a thought challenge. You could then say, client then specifically chose this thought to challenge. You can go more, right? There's a lot more you could add, but if you were to say we used a thought challenge and challenge thoughts related to everybody's judging me, and I'd probably put that in quotes if they were giving it to me. So I'm still specific to next session, used a thought challenge and challenged a different thought. However, there's also some approaches where I caution to say it, but like copy and paste, right? These are things that we know we do from day to day. So if I give out the handout of grounding techniques that have the 5 different styles, I kind of copy and paste, provide a grounding technique, went over 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, categories, body awareness, and mental exercises. Then I make it specific to the client by saying, client agreed to try these 2 before the next week. So I'm not going into what is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, what are all of the different mental exercises, but I'm still giving myself some time to recognize that that is an intervention that I as a professional feel is beneficial to this individual. And they were involved by giving me the thought or by agreeing to which ones they want to try. I often also use the words like explored or processed, right? Therapist explored client's anxiety. Again, we don't have to go into all of the anxiety unless it's very specific or you feel it's pertinent. But if it was just anxiety about driving, we don't have to talk about the first stop sign was so hard, but the second stop sign was easier. It can still just be captured by drove around the block. We process their client and therapist process anxiety by practicing homework of driving around the block. Again, not going into the details and what you process, but it's still captured that you did that intervention and gave them the space to explore and learn to be comfortable in the uncomfortable. But great questions, because there are some people who have paragraphs and some people have 2 lines. And as long as I can still get, you did this and they said something back, there was a dialogue and an interaction, I'm going to support that you still provided that service. So what did I do and what was the reception? Client refused to try breathing techniques. I've had that before. Nope, I'm not doing it. I tried it in the past. Okay, introduce breathing techniques, which client denied. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, random, but so like my therapist that I see still does paper notes. And watching her do them and now listening to all this, it's making me think about it. Because I asked her before, well, she's been a therapist obviously much longer than I have, because I've only been a therapist for about 2 years and I think she's been a therapist for like 30. But it makes me wonder when you say like, oh, they look for this blah blah. If somebody uses paper notes, then obviously they can't just be like, oh, here and hand them over. So they were gonna have to be like, oh, I have to compile them for you or whatever. But all the stuff we're talking about makes me wonder like how, if this is all so rigid, how could somebody write paper notes and that be the case? Because this is like so wildly rigid.
How are they getting that information to the billers in the first place? So there's probably some sort of system that is electronic, or that they're mailing something that's saying client, date of birth, this. Like it's already succinctly sent to them before they would audit to then look back.
Yeah, no, and I asked them, they have no EHR whatsoever. Because I was tripping about it. I was like, how do you do this? What is happening? And like they said they have no EHR because they don't trust it. Everything's paper files locked in a file, and they still fill out their billing by hand too. Yeah, like everything's by hand. Yeah, so it's kind of making me want to try that out. This is scary, a little scary, but it makes me wonder how that's possible.
what size of practice do you mind sharing? Because I think that also probably plays into the likelihood of getting audited if you are more of a single private practitioner versus somebody who's got 60 to 70 clinicians under one billing code or practice place. So is that maybe a factor at all for this person as well?
Yeah. Well, I asked her, she said she's never been audited.
Yeah.
Ever, not once, because like now I'm all well. I took a workshop with Barbara Griswold, whom you might be familiar with because she does a lot of trainings like this, like maybe a year ago. And after taking that, it made me absolutely like paranoid. The way she talked about it's like you're gonna get audited. It's not about if, it's about when. You're totally gonna get audited at some point. So I was like, oh my god, like super worried about it. And then then I was like, asked my therapist, like, how many times have you ever been audited? Like all freaked out. And she's like, and she said 0.
Yeah.
And then
that's
I asked
my experience, depending on the agency and size, and Medicaid is going to be the strictest versus some of those commercial payers, which is usually private practice.
Yeah, no, I got it. No, because I have a lot of, which we call Medicaid, which we call Quest here. I have a lot of Quest patients. So that does make, like, I'm, because because of all of these requirements and it's so hard to work with them, there's a lot of people who won't take Quest here. And for me, it was a political choice to take it, because the whole reason I even became a practitioner was to make sure that folks who need it the most get care. But I could see how it's scary working with them, just like hearing all these extra requirements that, quite frankly, I could be honest, I don't think I think after watching this, I'm like, oh, I meet maybe 50% of the documentation requirements that you talked about today. I'm like, oh, great. Okay.
Well, and that's how my position got created, because we had audits, I guess January of 23, and we had to go back and we had to provide a lot of support and a lot of documentation and show that we were doing it, even if it wasn't the way they needed it. And so my position was created. And let me tell you, people were not happy. Why are you telling me? I've been licensed for years. Why are you telling me how to document? And that's where we had to really say, it's not me, it's the compliance. We're just in compliance with what that payer is requiring. And we did have an audit and just got I got the email yesterday, 95% passing. And so that was a really big win for my company. But that also brings me to, if you're at a company, you're going to have a level of protection where, depending on if you're a contractor versus an employee, if you're a contractor, you may be required to give that payment back if you are found to be negligent or have something that is requested for reimbursement back to the payer. But in this situation, if you're an employee, that's on the agency. So there are still levels of protection as far as lessening some of that scariness. But my ethics teacher in grad school also majored in law. And so she was very scary. Like, you get in a car accident, you're in charge of that note no matter what. So I get some of those like intimidating approaches while trying to just say, like, you're still responsible for the work you did and that it's in the chart. So hopefully that brings some breath back into any of the strictness that was shown in the presentation today. But it did come directly from that, our company growing so fast, getting audited because we do accept and want access for all to be able to have counseling, and then just making adjustments. And that's the biggest thing that we've learned in compliance. If they see that we're trying and they see that we're growing, they're going to then still continue to pass us. And then it was a different company. It's not like we got audited back to back by the same agency, but we were able to then see the differences it made in passing with no issues. But yeah, this is the part they don't talk about in school. So I'm glad to have the dialogue and give a space to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And thank you again, and for you and Lana for putting this on, because not only did I not learn any of this in school, I've pieced it together since I decided to go into private practice. Like, there's not even a lot of places you can ask these questions. Like, my therapist is probably sick of me asking her questions. She's like, "You're here for therapy, dude. Like, why are you asking
anxiety? This is so therapeutic."
but it's not it's not like you could just ask any random therapist this stuff and they want to talk about it. So appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I have two questions, and you may not know the answer to this first one. Is there a window, like a time frame that you know of, like legally, that a payer can go back to audit?
That would be in a contract or a state, but I follow my EHR system's Facebook page. So I get to see a lot of questions from people in all levels of practice. And somebody just had this, and I can't remember, I feel like it was on the East Coast, but I have a template if anybody needs it, where somebody responded in that Facebook post saying, "Thank you so much for asking for this. Our statute of limitations are 12 months." And basically said, "I'm not paying you back anything." So it's going to depend a little bit more specific to your location, but that is information you can absolutely obtain and then support if you were ever to have any information requested or payments saying that they need back, depending on what that time frame is. So I don't know specific to your location, but I do know that that's something that you can follow up with, confirm, and I have a great template because I was like, I'm gonna save that. Hopefully I never need this letter, but now I have a great, and it has legalese in it. I mean, that person did a beautiful job. So I can provide that as a template to you.
Yeah, that makes sense to ask a specific payer, but that would be great to have that language for sure. And then my second question, this is something that you and I, just for full transparency, that you and I had discussed when I reached out and was consulting with you, that I think could be helpful for other folks. When you and I had, talked before, we had talked about using screening tools like the GAD-7 or the PHQ-9. And I remember you telling me that there was a billing code that you can use in a specific way to do that. Could you refresh my memory and then share with other folks about that?
I'm actually just going to go into my EHR system really quick on a different screen. So everything is still confidential, but I can pull that up. So essentially it looks like a consultation note, very similar to what you guys just saw in the presentation. But as long as the intake has happened and a person does those screeners, our company is able to go back and add on this code. So I'm just kind of clicking on some intakes I've done recently, and it is 96127. That stands for a brief emotional / behavioral assessment. So because they did those screeners and we had established services by them attending the intake, we go back and we do a 96127, which is indicating that behavioral or brief emotional / behavioral assessment.
Okay, and so for that, so when you do the 96127, you said as long as they've done the intake, you can bill for that. So is that something, because I typically send them in between sessions when be scheduled, just I do it, it's part of my process. Is that something I can bill in between sessions, or does it have to have the same service date as?
A great question, because it is flexible. So for example, in this chart, I did the intake on 110. At the time of the intake, I assigned the screeners. And then once we've confirmed, because it's not my clinical side, but another person will go through and do the billing, reflecting that the chart had the intake and it was billed on 111. So the next day. We've had some where we played around with screeners being available all the time versus being needed to be assigned. Truly, the CSSRS was being completed before an intake and having some scary suicidal ideations. And we felt like that was putting some stress on our clinicians to be aware of screeners before they met with a client. So we took some of those away, but we had people fill out those screeners weeks before when we were in the holidays. And as long as they attended their intake, we could then submit that service code to reimburse for the assessment. So there can be some gaps and delays from the intake, as well as when they completed the assessments and when you bill for them.
And do you know roughly how often we're able to bill the 96127?
I'm not sure. This is something that I've started seeing in our charts, well, probably since November. I would think it's probably going to be similar to possibly like an intake or possibly consultation, where there's probably a minimum of a month. Can't bill for it every time, even though sometimes I know with certain trauma therapies, you're always doing that PCL5. So I would look into it, because I don't have an exact answer, but I would caution that it's probably a minimum of a month based on other documentation requirements.
Gotcha. And last question that I have about this, thank you for humoring me. Is there a way that we could obtain a list somewhere of what screening tools we can use? So if you're doing the the Beck scale, does that fall under it? I heard you say the PCL-5, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yep. So it used to initially, before it was built into our EHR system, we had a lot of jot forms that we would have links. They would fill it out. We would upload it. It was just a little more convoluted. And it said Beck on there versus this one has a little bit different, but they're the same scientific evidence-based approach screeners. That would still be I think that emotional behavioral assessment that code is capturing.
Okay, so as long as it's evidence supported, it's something it's standardized and utilized like widely. It's not just something I made and giving my client.
Yeah.
Theoretically,
there's like ACEs, there's CAGE, there's a lot of them out there. MDQ, so SASE. That's what I used to do with the teens. So I think as long as it's something like that where it's got scientific proof of why we want to get that baseline, why we would maybe then resubmit the assessment, that would be supported.
Gotcha. No, I thought that was super cool when you shared that with me. Again, one of these things that we don't learn.
Yeah.
But
and it's something I'm not required to do. It just shows up because our billing and admin team is awesome. So thank you. I did not include that, but that is absolutely a way to get reimbursed for the efforts and care you're providing to your client while doing stuff sometimes outside of the session.
Yeah, no, and we're doing it anyway. So I think that's really great. So thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I am glad that Leilani had talked about the handwritten notes because that's how I do mines. So if I were to be what's the word?
Audited?
Audited by the insurance. Yes, thank you. So I do not submit my notes, correct?
Correct. I would respond asking what do you need so that you also don't have to do any guessing and you're also having communication so they don't think you're ignoring them. But then what do they need? And then they usually do not need the clinical document at the part of where you're actually doing the work. They're going to want more of that medical jargon of the F codes, the treatment plan signatures, and that information. But ask them directly, and they're going to be able to show how limited it can be and still being in compliance with the audit.
So I use Alma for my billing. So would I just provide the information that I submit to Alma as my EHR, or like if they say no, like we just need the billing code, etc. So would that be what I would submit to them, or
potentially? I would. As long as it still probably has some of those details, again, service date, the service code, the location. I'm not as familiar with Alma per se. I know the name and I know it exists, but ensuring that they have those specifics as far as reimbursement may just depend on what is recorded there.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you so much.
You have every right to advocate and say, what specifically are you asking so that you know you're not guessing. And then again, also advocating that I'm not giving you clinical documentation or I'm redacting information, but there's a lot of discussion in that Facebook group I have where they don't need that. They don't want that. Some people say they give it anyways. There was backlash of you shouldn't have to do that. And most of the times you don't. So just ask.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I mean, this has been amazing. I've been quiet, but I've been listening and taking notes. So thank you so much.
No problem. I did scroll down to the last slide. I am available on LinkedIn. So if you guys want to reach out, feel free to connect. It's a great resource as far as just having those connections in the professional world. Again, you can kind of see what my profile looks like. Some of my alphabet soup, my alma mater a little bit there. I am based out of Illinois, but licensed in 5 states. So again, I have some perspectives. Even if I don't know your specific situation, I might be able to direct where to look for that or provide some insight to at least getting you to that, that answer. But I really do love what I do. I never thought I'd be as much admin. So I like that I still get to do some intakes and keep my toe in the clinical world. But I'm very passionate about being able to have this accessible. We don't want the burnout in the field. We all know that we felt that 2020 pandemic as much as our clients did. And telehealth really developed from that, in my opinion. And I love the barriers it's breaking down. People who haven't been able to get off work can go on their lunch break in their car and talk to me. We're not having transportation as another barrier. So making sure that as we really open up to the telehealth world, we're still protecting ourselves as some of those pandemic regulations shifted again in Kentucky back in August of 23, and still being in compliance so that these can continue to be available for our clients. Any other questions, comments, concerns before we wrap up today? Thank you all so much for attending as well. This was really exciting to be able to just share the knowledge that I've gained over the years. Again, lots and lots of clinical work, but really being able to give that insight to the billing and admin side in this recent position I've had. Thank you.
Awesome. And then if you'll just go to the next slide. So in addition to reaching out to Anna in LinkedIn, thank you again so much for agreeing to do that and being willing to be a resource. If you'd like to have any access to the stuff that she provided today, you can always go to therapyhomeroom.com and find her shop and grab her stuff from there. So again, thank you so much for your time. I know it's a Friday. I know we're all in different time zones, so appreciate you all being here and asking really great questions. And again, this has been recorded, so even if we went over some stuff and you didn't remember, you can always access it later. I'll be sending that out next week, as well as a short survey. So any feedback that you have, I know Anna had said she wants feedback, but also, so we know what type of support everybody's needing, what all folks are, or what folks are looking for, and how we can support you going forward. So thank you so much for your time. And Anna, thanks so much for putting this together and answering all of our questions.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and be looking out for that survey and the recording soon. All right. Bye, everybody.
You're welcome.